context for generation, and situate the cohort within the cohorts of longitudinal studies of youth and children in Australia. So generation has many of the questions that are included in the previous LSAE cohorts. It has the same starting point, year 10, but the cohort is born in 2007. As some of you may know, I've been intimately involved in the longitudinal study of Australian children, which is a birth cohort where the children were born slightly earlier. So you can think about generation in a couple of different ways if you think in the context of Australian cohort studies of children and young people. So one, as a birth cohort, where we have information that's being collected from year 10 onwards, and we'll talk about linkages which enable us to go back to the first year of school. And so you can think about them as birth cohorts, and this is the latest in terms of the birth cohorts that's being collected in Australia. So with earlier LSAE cohorts being, considered, could be also considered to be birth cohorts. You could also consider them to be youth cohorts, followed from age 15 or year 10 of age, and there again you could potentially use generation in combination with both LSAE and also LSAC data, because LSAC data also has information collected using the same questions as LSAE. So that's just a bit of a context for the survey if you're thinking about it in the broader terms. All these surveys are available on the Australian Data Archives as well, so and are relatively easily accessible. In terms of the specifics around the research questions, there's a number. So what's the motivation and barriers faced by young people to enter post-school training or work? What are the long-term impacts of events such as the pandemic that might persist over time? What are the policy influences on educational pathways and outcomes for those who are identified as equity groups? And as Andrew said, there's really 4 that are formally considered to be equity groups. I'll note that UQ has been doing further work looking at other equity groups, and we do collect information about these sorts of equity groups in the survey. What are the school factors that influence post-school education and employment? And we have a school context survey, which Dan's going to talk about, which will really gives us a much better handle on school policies than previously. What early childhood development and developmental factors shape post-school destinations? I'll talk a little bit more later, but we plan to link to the Australian Early Development Census data as part of this cohort, and then ask students active and informed members of communities. So we have a number of measures of extracurricular activities and volunteering in the community as well. In terms of the methodology for the student wave, and I should say up front, and I'll talk more about this as we go through, the survey was designed to be COVID proof. And so the structure of the survey is a little bit different to how you might ordinarily structure a sample survey. So rather than just taking a random sample of students within schools, a stratified survey, we approached a number of schools and we tried to recruit all those schools, and we were thinking about, well, what would make participation in the survey useful for schools, and taking a random sample of say 20 students from a class wasn't really going to cut it. So we had this idea that we would make it available to all students within that particular year level and generate a school report, which I'll show you an example of later. Also, what we had the idea of is making it useful for students themselves. And so what we have is we've had tailored reports based on student participation and questions and feedback. So in wave 1, students completed a career interest test, which I'll talk a little bit more about in detail later. And every student got a tailored report back if they chose to provide us with their contact details. So that was another way in which we were trying to feed back on the fly during field work to make the survey. We had 313 schools participate at the beginning. We were able to adapt and change. So Dan's team at Australian Council of Educational Research did a fantastic job of working with schools and school systems to ensure that we were able to get the survey into the field. We had this compressed time frame, and we also had a situation where some schools wanted to participate if they had a passive parental consent, but couldn't really administer the survey, didn't have the resources and staffing needed to administer the survey in schools, which is how we had Wave 1 surveys set up. So that was a challenge. So we had information collected on demographics, education expectations, plans, career interest and subject choices, employment, school engagement, belonging support, COVID-19, homework and tutoring, and online learning. In terms of plans and career interests, we had basic information collected about whether students intended to complete Year 12, their expected levels of education. We also had a new measure that was newly developed for our survey, which was a short version of the comprehensive assessment of basic interests, CABIN. We had some questions about career advice and also whether or not peers, what peers intended to do. One of the features of the survey is that we have a large number of peers who are participating. And so there'll be opportunities for analysts to also look at peer influences, if you're thinking about the average intentions of peers within that particular school. So the measure of career interest is called the Comprehensive Assessment of Basic Interests, CABIN, and we worked with Rong Su from the US to develop up a survey. You'll see the precise items in the data user guide, but it can be used to extract, and we have done so for data users, the Collins-Ryasek model of career interests, which is realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. But we've also explicitly designed the survey so there are overlapping and corresponding items to be able to capture interest in engineering, physical science, maths and computer science, life and medical sciences, and social sciences, with a doff at the cap to social sciences, primarily not so much because they're of policy interest, but because they're of interest to our survey team. In terms of the subjects and courses, so we were capturing Year 11 and 12 subjects being undertaken in Year 10 in Wave 1, using the subject code that was developed for the longitudinal study of Australian children. Thank you to the LSA team for that. We also capture vet subjects as well. In that particular instance, we're capturing the main subjects, but we also have an open-ended response that's being coded by our colleagues at the Social Research Centre, who were managing the field work for both Wave 1 and moving forward. Their support has been fantastic during the process. We're capturing parental employment and students' employment. And then we're also collecting a lot of information around school engagement, belonging, and support. So the school belonging measure, it's a short 3-item measure, but it's also been included in PISA. We have a student-teacher relationships measure as well, which is also included in PISA. We have an active learning and academic challenge scale, which has been previously administered through the Australasian Survey of Student Engagement. We have a measure of school engagement, which captures behavioural, affective and cognitive engagement. That includes skipping school and skipping classes. And we also have a measure of social support, both instrumental and effective support for students. In terms of parents, education and expectations, this is student reports, student perceptions, which often drive behaviour of their parents, highest levels of education, occupation, employment, their country of birth, and their parents' educational and occupational expectations, what they think they should do. For demographics, we have quite a large number, and we're adding to those. So we have sex, and by sex I mean gender identity. Actually, it should be more accurately gender identity. So what students identify as, their age, Indigenous status, country of birth, year of arrival, their immigration status if relevant, language spoken at home, disability, household structure, as reported by students. In terms of the survey completes and sample sizes, we have 26,000 students who, over 26,000 students who started the survey. Not everyone completed the survey, so we're being really explicit and open with data users about that. And there's a number of different, but we're providing all the data that we have available to us, to you, to use, and you can use it how you would like to use it. But we have 15,321 who completed every single item on the survey, or just about, if it was relevant to them. And then we have partial completes that completed over, and they're about 11,000, some of whom just completed a few items, but many of whom had substantial proportions of completions. In terms of the demographics, which were asked towards the end of the survey, gender identity, we had 41% students identify as being male, 52% female, 2% non-binary, 1% a different term, and 4% prefer not to say. And we ask, and we'll be asking this question every way, because we acknowledge that gender identity can change over time. We have a large portion of students who have a parent who has never been to university, and this is relevant for, if they think about it, equity groups. So 47%. The majority of students are in major cities. We have fewer in remote. So you would have noted from the participation rates that the Northern Territory was hard for us to get into. There was difficulties in terms of in that jurisdiction, both in terms of the timing of the survey, but also that many remote areas were locked down, and also the capacity to conduct online surveys in these remote areas was more difficult. 15% of students identified as having some form of disability, and 4% identified as being Indigenous, which is relative. These are not unweighted data, so this is just raw data, just to give you a sense of what you'd be playing with. In terms of the impact of COVID-19, how we might measure this and our strategy for collecting information about this, there's sort of two tranches. So one's around policies designed to support students. So we have policies around that, which Dan will talk about. And then we also have student reports, so their self-reported impacts, and also their capacity to access support in their school. The impacts measures were taken from another study, a sister study, if you like, called COSMO in the UK, which was run around the same time with the same sort of age range of students, focused on the impacts and equity issues associated with COVID-19 in the UK and England in particular. And so that we're collecting information about access to computer internet in 2021. So this is the primary period of the lockdowns, difficulties during 2021, questions about what the schools did in terms of helping students catch up, and also their student self-perceived impact on learning and motivation. As I mentioned previously, we hope to link NAPLAN data to the survey, but that's not something that we're releasing in wave one. In terms of student survey key constructs, I'll also note that we have a number of open-ended questions, and we've got open-ended questions of almost 15,000 students. And we think that's really valuable data for data users, but that's in a restricted release. For many data users, they won't really be interested in going through qualitative analysis. They'll be more focused and interested in just some quantitative top-line information, and we're hoping to do that for the topic modelling